Hey everyone, welcome to Osquery office hours for March. March is a little notable as this is now the first anniversary of the pandemic for most of us Americans, which is a little bit crazy in a way, but here we are, a year of Osquery extra remote. Not like we were all in the same place. So
We used to get to hear some nice Collide Office background chatter on your
welcome
video.
everyone. That's true, that's a marker. Collide has closed that office, by the way. So
Makes sense. Who needs offices?
who needs offices? Let's see. Announcements and highlights. I don't think I've got much for announcements that aren't down on the agenda at this point. Anyone else? Okay. Questions, issues, PRs people want to discuss. Generally, the intent here is to make sure anyone in the larger community has a chance to ask questions that they're not sure of. I'll pause a moment.
Yeah, I have a question actually.
Ooh, yeah. Yeah, what's up?
Alessandro, I think you were talking at some point about there's like a unhandled exception when the kernel version this is for BPF, when you try to enable BPF events and the kernel version isn't the right one, there's like an unhandled exception or something. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
So this was before we fixed it with the last pull request for BPF, and the major issue there was mostly that some system calls are not implemented in the ARM64 architecture, like before, for example, and things like that. But yeah, everything is handled as far as I know right now. If the system call is not present, it will print a warning and continue if possible.
Got it. Okay. Did this manifest as a TOB string error or something like that?
Yeah, that is possible. We
Okay.
have some kind of expected class that uses string errors that they are in the same namespace. So yeah, that could be
Got
it.
it. Okay, because someone reported a startup crash to me that I thought sounded like the one you described, and they were seeing that TOB string error. I asked them to file an issue in Osquery so that we could have the info publicly, but they haven't done that. So it sounds hopeful that you've already addressed it. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe. If you can get the issue, that would be helpful, and see if it's something we didn't catch.
Will do.
Alessandro, did you just say you have a pending PR or is all of this merged?
It has already been merged.
Okay,
It's
great.
like in 4.5.1, I guess.
Oh, merged a while ago then.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know what version Zach was.
Maybe just after 4.5.1.
This must be 451 because that's the only one that includes BPF support currently, right?
460.
Okay, true, good. I'll find out I'll try and get that issue filed. But thank you.
Thanks.
Toss out a quick question we got on Slack. See where people fall about right now, if OS query is configured to log results to a path that does not exist, it kind of just goes on its happy way. And some discussion about whether or not OS query should create the log directory if it doesn't exist.
When you say goes on its happy way, do you mean like exits?
I have no idea, actually. I don't have this problem.
I see.
It might crash.
If I remember, I think it actually just exits.
Well, it's probably better.
Yeah, I mean it's okay, but But yeah, so the question is, should Osquery create the log path if it doesn't exist? Well, and I think it should. I mean, I just think it's countless times that users have been like, oh, Osquery won't start up. And it's like, well, did you create the log directory? It's like, I personally wouldn't expect that I'd have to create the log directory, that I just configure it with Osquery and Osquery would create it.
I could kind of argue both ways, but I'd be happy to accept the PR. I think I'd maybe say we should not do it under Osquery I behavior. Like we should put some effort to only doing it in daemon mode, because there's like a piece here where if you have it pointing in a non-existent directory, there's some chance you just have a stock configuration that isn't actually what you want. So there's like, how do you bubble that up? And how do you weigh that against, you probably did what you want, just don't have a bug. So
yeah, well, and I think the logger plugin would not be initialized in Osquery I.
I think you're right, but I'm just sort of saying it aloud.
Okay, got it.
If someone PRs it, I wouldn't oppose the PR. But I don't know that I'll take that on. But I think I'm in favor.
I think it might be nice. Oh, what's that?
Do we check whether we fill the disk? Because I was wondering if the administrator for any reason forgets to create the log directory, maybe we can end up writing and appending things to a place in a log file that is never rotated, potentially filling the partition.
I think the question is just which failure mode do you want, right? Maybe someone configures Osquery and typos a directory somewhere. So like Osquery is logging to somewhere they didn't set up log rotation on, and you fill the disk, versus someone, versus like macOS takes an update, blows away all of var log. Now Osquery doesn't restart. So it kind of just feels like, which problem do you want to solve? And this is why I feel like I can argue both ways, right? And I suspect if I looked at existing software, I can find examples both that like, they'll just create your log directories.
Yeah. I'm in favor of creating the folder. I was just wondering if we could cause issues one way or the other.
Yes.
Agreed. I think before PRing it, I'd like to make sure we get sign off from Teddy in case he has some alternate considerations that or feels strongly. But it seems like mostly there's consensus to do this.
I feel like if someone feels like writing it, it's probably a small amount of work, and if Teddy wants to block it, he can, and if no one's excited to write it, then it'll languish.
All right.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think we also had instances where customers forgot to create the folder for the log files, and they were getting errors, and they had no idea why. So yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, there's also another case which is not with a folder, but related to the installation of packages on Windows, where the package installs the flag file, which means that then when it updates the version, it deletes the flag file. So there's an issue open about it. And in fact, I think even there it would be better that Osquery creates the flag file if it's missing, or even it does not even need to create it actually. Just if it's there, it will read it. If it is not there, it won't. Yeah, I'm not.
I would rather start without the flag file than create it. And that one's a little bit more interesting. I can't decide. If I specify launch with this flag file, and that flag file contains like talk to this TLS server, and the flag file has been corrupt or removed or something, do I still want Osquery to run without it? I don't know the answer to that. That one's less clear to me than the logs.
Well, I would say that if you are specifying it, well, okay. I would say if you are specifying it, I would expect the program to tell me when something is different from what I'm expecting. Though I could also say that probably almost everyone does pass that configuration. So there is maybe really no case where Osquery would not warn you if it's missing, which means we should probably always warn about it. Warn if the file is missing. And maybe even stop working, actually. Yeah.
I'd say probably exit.
Yeah, exit. Yeah.
Okay, so I think sentiment is that if the flag file were passed on the command line or in the configuration file, then we should exit if not finding it. And that might imply that we have a problem with our WMI builds. Like if there's something in the WMI that creates that error condition, then that's kind of a WMI issue that we should address.
WMI?
You said this was a Windows packaging issue.
Oh yeah,
MSI?
the MSI.
MSI.
Yeah. No, sorry.
Thank you. MSIs.
So yeah, so the thing simply is that we should not include the flag file to be installed because it's an empty file, especially. As we should not include it in the MSI so that at upgrade time it doesn't overwrite the user one, the user modified one.
Makes sense. I don't remember if there's a way to tell an MSI only create this if it doesn't exist.
There is, but I don't think it makes sense again because it will be empty. If you need it, you just create it with something in it. Yeah.
It depends on like what do you want the out of the box experience to be. Do you run the MSI and is Osquery running, or do you run the MSI and then you have to edit an empty file, or do you run the MSI and then you have to copy default example.conf to osquery.conf and edit that?
Well, I wouldn't make, so the thing is, I wouldn't have the service specify the path to the flag file by default, so it doesn't need any flag file there.
Oh, I'd go the other way, actually, because I think editing Windows services is very difficult for people. So I would say if we ship a Windows service, it probably makes more sense for us to ship some kind of default config file. You know, if we take like some of maybe the Apache examples or other things, right? I feel like I've seen a default config file that has like common options that are documented with comments. So you can be like, oh, here's the thing I uncomment to do X.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, it makes sense. I think what I was saying that is that if we are going to install an empty file, it doesn't really make sense. But if that empty file it's actually contains comments, even if it's ignored by Osquery, yeah,
it makes more sense. But we definitely wouldn't want it overwritten, right? And like I know how to do that in a Debian package, but not in an MSI offhand.
I mean, what we can do is install instead we can do an example file. Exactly, we can do an osquery.flagfile.example with the comments, so they can copy it and then
And then the service would be configured to use a flag file at a path that does not exist, and the person would be expected to copy the flag file before starting the service.
Okay, you're right. We are back at the same problem.
Well, I guess one thing I would say is I'm not sure that the service needs to start automatically when someone installs an Osquery MSI, because if it does, it's kind of like you start logging, but you haven't yet configured anywhere for logs to go. You're using resources on the system, but what is the real benefit? Like, I think it'd be fine just to create a service in the like disabled state, or I'm not sure what it would be called on Windows, but
I agree.
I think there's also another issue about it actually now that because I think we have a mix, like I don't recall, macOS probably doesn't get auto configured, so it won't auto start. I think you have to manually add it, and so instead maybe on Linux it is already added. So yeah, we have this mix, and probably we should just be consistent and have everything in disabled state, maybe.
think my only real opinion is that we should not expect people to edit service definitions because that's hard and weird, and we're likely to push new ones in an update.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can give the default, but then they should give commands to enable it. Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Any other sort of broad questions? I sort of assume not, because this looks like the usual suspects. And okay, cool. Agenda. Someone wrote down host enrollment procedure. Not sure whose note this is.
It's actually from us. So
Cool. Take it away.
Yeah,
what's funny is it was there before I appended to it, so somebody else added it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's something I've been thinking about this week as well, but it wasn't me.
It was reported to us that hosts can fall into a condition where they multiple hosts have the same identifier. And it's not clear what caused that, but the effect is bad. At first, it would fail to enroll, and we were seeing that enrollment failure would cause a TLS logger to crash. And so the fix to that, Teddy put that fix in, it's been merged. That was just an issue of like, and now I'm blanking on what was the exact fix.
Order of initialization. There was something starting and
right.
using the logger before it was initialized.
That's right. That compounded the problem because it would not obey the enrollment back off of when it fails. It's supposed to back off a period of time that increases as it gets an additional problem. Anyway, that's that'll be in, I guess, 4.7. But the other effect that we were told happens is Fleet, when it gets multiple hosts calling it with the same identifier, locks the database. And I don't know what locks the database means. I don't know if that means that all of the hosts with the colliding identifier are now unavailable, or if it means a more general type of problem. So I don't know if that was reported to Zach or if he's heard word of that.
Yeah, so that's been reported to us, and we added a like cooldown period for host enrollment. So if a host with a given identifier has enrolled in the last minute or something, we essentially tell it like, no, you can't enroll, because we were seeing just like, the thing you have to imagine is that if it's actually multiple different Osquery processes with the same identifier, then you keep overwriting the node key. And so then you just have like this cascading failure of re-enrollments, and they all just start clobbering each other, and you get like tons of writes to the database. So we added this cooldown period, which was a while ago now. So I'd be curious if these folks are experiencing this with a current version of Fleet or
a while ago. How long ago?
Oh, like couple months, I think.
So a couple of questions. So Zach, you were seeing this where multiple hosts had the same host identifier coming in. And maybe that host identifier was something not very unique. Mike, where are you seeing it? Are you seeing it on like a given host in some kind of weird crash loop, or are you seeing the same sort of not very unique host ID across multiple hosts?
Well, we're trying to get better information, better details on this. It's secondhand. But
my belief about this is that what happens is people are cloning VM images and they're not being reinitialized with new UUIDs. Mm-hmm. And when Osquery is configured with -- host identifier equals UUID, which used to be our default recommendation for in the docs for Fleet, then Fleet sees it as the same host trying to enroll. Yeah. So we've switched our default recommendation to host identifier equals instance. which means that you get a unique identifier per Osquery database. And that, I believe, should resolve the problem with duplicates, except, of course, it's theoretically possible for UUIDs to collide, but it's pretty big.
It's also, the one caveat with that is if the database is lost, erased or deleted, or for some reason has to be restarted, then the instance is regenerated.
I'm not sure that's wrong, though.
No, that's probably the intended behavior, but, well, I mean, what else can you do? If you have to save it, you have to save it in the database.
Well, it's a trade-off that people need to consider when deploying, and it's something that I would like to solve better on like the fleet server end. But at some point, it's just a question of like, how and where do we draw the line for this deduplication? And then what are the knock-on effects of doing that?
So I mean, I've struggled a little bit with sort of related issues on the Clyde side, right? And like one of the things I think is this is predominantly going to be a TLS endpoint problem, right? This isn't actually kind of an Osquery on the host problem in so much as like you can separate the two. And I feel like the core piece of this is that the TLS servers want to have some kind of stable identifier for a node, right, for an Osquery instance. And the problem is across like, there's no good data. Like endpoints are terrible. So there's no consistent data. So what we have today is we have this mechanism where you can tell Osquery what to use as that identifier for that initial enrollment, right? And I almost wonder if we want to kind of like shift into another direction. It's be like the enrollment request could just include all of them. And then
the same thing, yeah.
You know, then it's sort of just like your TLS endpoint does whatever your TLS endpoint does. There's less configuration. You get a UUID for the hardware. You get a UUID for the instance. You get the host name.
I like that idea actually. If removing a configuration option for users sounds great, and then having more information for the TLS server to deal with sounds like a bit of a pain in the ass, but maybe more, it'll give us more options to try to do that deduplication more effectively.
I mean, it would also let you choose what to do without having to like redeploy Osquery, right?
Yeah.
So that's a big problem right now, that you have to set this in the flag file. And so right now folks have to redeploy Osquery. So this is something that like I'm trying to address by I'm trying to figure out how to make the flag files configurable like via Orbit, via our new agent. And
I mean, you know how Launcher does it.
What's that?
You know how Launcher does it.
Yeah, I know how Launcher does it, but Launcher doesn't ask the server for the flags.
It could though, actually. I mean, that was the original envisionment of the control channel. We just never found we needed it.
Right.
The appeal of changing agent behavior to provide sort of all of the above identifiers on enrollment is that we don't have to transition. We don't have to worry about a host suddenly identifying differently than it used to. So if we were to make any other kind of change, hosts would have to somehow associate their previous identifier with their new one. If we change the behavior so that they provide all of the information they used to and now other kinds of identifier, we can make that transition easily.
So as I think about this, I'm not reviewing code. I excuse my own confusion about what's Launcher specific and what's Osquery specific. But somewhere in the guts of Launcher, we actually, enrollment requests get tagged with additional metadata. And I forget if that's in Launcher or Osqueries.
Osquery includes that additional metadata as well.
So that's actually
maybe not the same metadata, but it's some metadata.
Or maybe it's configurable. I don't know. So that's actually probably where Collide does a lot, is we'll look at the inbound serial number. We used to. We don't actually do that anymore, and we do that based on the supplemental enrollment information. So I kind of wonder if one route to fixing this while preserving some backwards compatibility is to add things to that enrollment information blob, and then slowly deprecate the idea of a configurable node key and just be like, it's in there.
Yeah. Well, and maybe I need to take a look again at what Osquery sends during these enrollment requests, and there might be more that we could work with there.
And I guess what I'm suggesting is that we take all of the things you can configure. Okay, so if Osquery does actually send this additional information, that's not a launcher thing, then what we should do is we should take every possible thing you can set the host identifier to and shove it into that extra enrollment information, and then get rid of the host identifier in like 4 releases.
Yeah. Yeah, and plus we can also add more without, right?
Yeah, I don't want to get too heavy, but yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to be submitting 10 megabytes in a hello message, but if there's ever a 4th string that makes sense to submit, we could always add it.
Yeah.
I would love to remove some of the configuration flags. Osquery has too many for any one person to be familiar with.
Yeah, and to understand them, you have to read the code. You can't even get the defaults from documentation or from the Osquery help message.
A thing Teddy said a little while ago, which sort of resonated with me, was that you can either have very few flags or it doesn't matter and you have infinity flags. And we're way into infinity.
I think we're worse than Git.
Different problem space. I mean, it's much more analogous to Apache, right? Like Apache has thousands of configuration knobs because you want to do anything, and it's similar.
But
well, coming back to the sorry, Alessandro.
Is changing the way we identify to the TLS the short-term approach?
Yeah, so one thing I was going to say is I think that we need to maybe understand what the expected behavior in these situations is, because I'm not sure that actually that changing what we send will enable us with certainty to get the outcome that the user expects. Because it kind of seems to me like we're going to end up in the situation where if we send a unique identifier per Osquery database, then we're just going to say, well, we don't trust the hardware UUID, so we use the Osquery UUID, and then it's the same as if we just tell people just always use instance as your host identifier.
So I mean, I can, from having looked at this a bit at Collide, and y'all have maybe looked at it similar, unfortunately there's no right answer, because you end up crafting something that's like great for people with laptops, and then it just explodes horribly when someone's like, now I'm checking in all of my cloned VMs. Right. Or you have things that like feel okay, but then they don't do the right thing in the context of like a time machine restoration. And what do you want to happen on a time machine restoration? And what do you want to happen in a migration assistant, upgrade? And like, maybe what you really want to say is, actually, this machine's been upgraded to new OS. It may as well have a new DB. Like, there's no continuity here. So there's just this deep set of questions that I think, to some degree, end up being this very particular TLS server design, right? And maybe you can go further, and you might say it's a very site-specific thing. I could imagine that Fleet deployed somewhere to primarily manage server VMs is going to be dramatically different than Fleet deployed somewhere to manage employee laptops. Is going to be pretty different than Fleet deployed to manage per instance, per user Windows VMs, right? So like each of these has its own things, and I feel like the simplest thing to do is to take the complexity out of the Osquery configuration and basically push it into the server side, and just be like, you get this blob of information, and then you have to figure out what you want. Like, what do you want to have happen? Because this is all the knobs you have.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, it might mean that really we're just pushing, either the TLS server just decides what it wants to do, or we're just pushing more configuration flags onto the TLS server.
we can share a couple of use cases for this on why we have so many flags in there, which I don't like personally. But one of the use cases is to somehow take a new endpoint and make it inherit the ID of another machine that you may have decommissioned because maybe it was broken. And you want to keep the continuity in the history because maybe the user on the machine is the same. The second problem with having a true unique identifier is that hardware IDs do fail. We had a customer that had the UID of the machine zeroed out. And this was happening when those machines were being serviced by the manufacturer. So they would just take the motherboards, they would just refresh the BIOS on them, and when they would come back, there was no ID anymore. So the fix there was similar. They would just hard code the host ID to the previous UID. So yeah, on one side, I was actually thinking about the same as Seth. So trying to send all the history to this machine, and then you, on the server, you decide that this machine is 90% similar to that other machine, so you can merge them. But this will break the use case of these people.
So I have a couple of things, though. I don't think it breaks any of those use cases any more than today breaks them, right? Because today you have to decide what the identifier. So this identifier is only used during the enrollment, right? And then everything subsequent is based off the server-created node ID. So if you talked about wanting to preserve continuity and you have like effectively a backup, then like it's kind of on you to copy the node key in the Osquery database from one to the other. You'll have all the same continuity. So there's a little bit of a weird case here of like, well, I want to preserve continuity in the face of subsequent re-enrollments. And I feel like that starts becoming unsolvable. But some of what I'm suggesting is, the options right now are, right, send a UUID, send the host name, and send like an instance identifier, which is specific to this particular root directory. So the answer is to send all three of them, the subsequent enrollment information, and then you can just decide what you want. Because I think what I'm getting to is having to reconfigure end user state when you realize you've made a mistake is just terrible, and we shouldn't make people do it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes, agreed on that for sure. And I mean, I think if we start sending all these values, at least at first, the way that Fleet's going to respond to that is we're going to use the one that corresponds to host identifier equals instance, because it's while it may not get the functionality that people want in every case, it seems to be the most correct in the most cases from the way that I've reasoned about it and the way that I've worked with folks who've seen these kind of issues.
I suspect that's correct. I think the one thing to be wary of is cloned VMs, especially cloned VMs that already have an instantiated Osquery instance.
Oh, yeah, let's see. So then, yeah, okay, so that's the worst. That's the worst, most pathological case is like, imagine that you get the clone VM that has the same hardware UUID and the existing Osquery database. So now both the instance identifier and the hardware identifier are the same. And then what do you do? I don't know.
I actually had a point about it. Yeah. I was wondering if we could just regenerate the ID. If Osquery is able to capture the error that the ID is duplicated, it should either give up forever or allow the instance to regenerate the ID.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, now that we've introduced this cooldown period for enrollments in Fleet, we could detect that that the reason why the enroll failed is because we believe that this is a re-enrollment with a duplicate ID, and we could return that as an error state to Osquery. And if Osquery can then regenerate the instance UUID, that might work?
The only
At a
trouble
glance,
is
it sounds like it works.
it will work with instance, but it will not work with anything else.
You only need
Right.
it to work with instance, though, because if you assume you're sending them all in the enrollment block, then you just say, "Oh, this smells fishy. Try again."
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. But I mean, are we still talking about the short term or the longer term? Are we going to change all of this in the next version?
I think I'm going to say that I don't think anything is going to change in the short term, just because no one it sounds like the people with immediate problems probably have the immediate solution of just setting it to use instance and being like, you'll get a couple of dupes and like this is the best you can do easily, right? So there's your short term fix, and I think the midterm fix is to remove the configuration variable, and to get there, we add more information to the enrollment block. And then TLS servers can start using the enrollment block, and then we phase out this option. So it's sort of a two-step thing, right? It's make sure we have all the possibilities in the enrollment block, and then there's the, okay, cool, now this thing is pointless, and it's been pointless for a year. Can we remove it?
I'm on board with that.
Are we going to keep compatibility between an old Osquery and a new fleet, and a new Osquery and an old fleet?
I mean, we'll have to manage that on the TLS server side, and it's definitely not. I mean, it will take work.
I mean, to some degree, eventually things change. So the answer is not, do we support some amount of old versus new? It's how far do you support the old versus new?
So yeah, I was wondering for the short term, because if the duplicated ID is indeed sent back to Osquery as an error, regenerating the instance ID should be like an easy fix, I guess, that we can do like right now, probably.
I mean, to me, it sounds like, it sounds great. I mean, I'd be happy to return that error from Fleet, but it doesn't immediately solve the problem. If the problem is that the person is using host identifier equals UUID, then they still have to change their flag in the short term. Like, it sounds like no matter what we do, they have to change the flag in the short term. But this proposed solution from Alessandro does help avoid the situation in which someone has cloned a VM with an already instantiated Osquery database so that it has the same instance identifier.
I think before we understand if you need to make any changes in the current case, you should double check what's in the enrollment information block, because that may or may not be enough to force a deduplication.
Right.
And it sounds like then there's also the proposal that we sort of create an error response processing path to force regeneration of an instance ID.
Yeah. Okay. In one more scenario. So actually, if you've got an Osquery database that's instantiated, it has a valid node key, and then the VM is copied, it's not even going to get to enrollment. You're just going to have a bunch of VMs using the same node key and dumping data as if they're the same host.
Yep, unless the server can detect it and force re-enrollment.
So then you probably like, at least in the case of Fleet, you don't end up with duplicate host records. You don't end up with the enrollment issue, but you do end up with, like, you think you're live querying one host, but actually you're live querying the 1,000 that share the same node key or something like that. So it's a bit of a bottomless pit of pain and suffering.
So interestingly, this is a little bit tangential, but a little bit related. As y'all may know, Collide is an MDM now, an Apple MDM. And as such, I have spent some amount of time reading the Apple MDM docs. And the Apple MDM docs actually have a very similar situation in them with, I would say, a very unsatisfactory conclusion. So In Apple MDM land, hosts are identified by the identity certificates on them. And those identity certificates can come in by a couple of mechanisms. It doesn't matter. It's a cert embedded in the keychain. And and buried in a footnote of the Apple MDM docs is roughly, in that identity certificate is the host's UUID. So, it's a UUID based on all of the internal motherboard chipset mumbles, right? And buried somewhere in the Apple docs is this tiny little footnote that says, MDM servers should verify the identity certificate against the host's UUID. That's all it says. And if you work with this for a while, you're like, why? And what it's doing is it's describing the problem case, this problem case of like, someone has this machine and they have like time machine restored to this machine, or like done something to restore a backup, a migration assistant. When you do that, you end up with effectively the keychains. So you get some of the certificates. So the new host presents the identity certificate, but it has a mismatched UUID, which is kind of good because the new host is actually not fully enrolled in the MDM. It's like half. It's in this weird, like, thinks it's in the MDM, but isn't because it didn't actually go through the policy installs. But Apple doesn't provide a way to recover from this. They're just like, you should invalidate it, but it doesn't trigger re-enrollment. So it's a very similar problem that we have here, where like, if you copy your Osquery database, there's like, well, what do you do? So there's like a piece there of like, how do you detect it? And then like, can you force re-enrollment?
I think the reality is there are always going to be pathological cases, and trying to make the most common issues work better for folks sounds like a worthwhile goal.
I think as long as we give ourselves the rope, try and give ourselves as much rope as possible, then I think we'll be in good shape. Okay.
So Mike, it'd be helpful to hear from your folks that you're working with which version of Fleet they're on, and to try to identify whether the issue is that they're using host identifier equals UUID, and whether they indeed have the same UUID across many hosts. That would at least help us confirm that like what we think is going on is what's going on, and decide, use that to inform the best course of action.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think based on the discussion, they have an infrastructure that they're not fully in control of. I believe it's virtual machine image based, and your theory is the same as ours, which is they copied, they didn't alter it. So they may not even be aware of the problem of what they're doing, but we try to explain it. So we'll go through it again with them and make sure we cover again all of the variables.
Yeah, and it may be solved. I mean, so if they're using a current version of Fleet and this is causing Fleet to crash or to have like reduced service availability, then like clearly we need to fix this on the Fleet side. That's just a bug that we need to fix. And if and then the other thing is their easiest solution at this point, my guess would be, is probably switch to host identifier equals instance. That's
recommended, and asked for a follow-up today, so we'll see what they.
Sure, and I know for a lot of folks that doing something like that is not very feasible, but the next best option we can offer them is upgrade the version of Osquery, and that seems about just as infeasible, but also isn't a solution as of today.
Taking a really quick peek at the source code, I believe that in the enrollment request, you should see both the UUID and the instance ID today.
Okay.
It was UUID according to Stefano. Okay.
So you may have all the rope you need to just look at all the data that comes in the enrollment request.
Yeah, so okay, so then actually it sounds like maybe we can fix this on the Fleet side as well.
I might be misreading the source code, but it looks like you get the Osquery info table, which has both. So
Osquery info table has both. Okay. So yeah, so then potentially that's another path for these folks to take, will be to pick up the next release of Fleet if I've had a chance to make that fix.
Okay, sounds good.
But immediately, I think what we've discussed prior to that seems the most viable solution to me.
Yeah.
Oh, another enrollment related thing that I think I've seen recently is, I believe I have, and I'm having a hard time reproducing it now, but I believe I've seen a host make an enroll request, receive a successful response for it, and then maybe not use, maybe there's a race condition or something, or two requests are being made in parallel or what, but it then maybe doesn't use the new node key in the first request. So then the server says like, you're invalid. So then Osquery clears the node key and then it tries to re-enroll. Just throwing it out there if that's like familiar in any way to anyone. I'm trying to figure out like a good reproduction for it.
Any chance that's in Launcher, or is that pure Osquery?
Well, so it's related to that thing that Josh Brower brought up with Launcher,
Yeah.
Seth, if that's what you're thinking. Although I think that I've seen it done by plain Osquery like sometime in the last couple of weeks, but I can't remember exactly how I did that or what the situation was.
So, Launcher, there's something that Launcher does have an update mechanism, right? Which I just patched in the most recent Launcher, where like if you're running off of a slightly older package with Launcher, one of the first things that might happen is Launcher will also download a new OS query and then restart everything. So you could potentially see a race condition there. I don't know that I've ever actually seen that in the wild, at least in terms of enrollment. But I have definitely seen like a host gets a node key, and then as it's going through initial population, it will suddenly like restart and come back in 5 minutes, and then pick up where it left off. So we've seen that. So there's definitely a race possibility. And a thing that I saw recently is I recently pushed a new Launcher release out, and several of my Windows machines re-enrolled. And I don't understand why. There's like somehow the old daemon was still running, and then the new one started, and like something caused a regeneration of the node key, or like a new enrollment request, which makes no sense to me. So we just deleted all the old hosts, and we were like, we don't understand this. This is weird. But I don't know. All these things kind of smell linked. So I don't know, stuff to look for.
All right.
We probably only have another couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Had a pretty good sprawling conversation. I think I want to at least go through these real fast. So nominally, we're about a month behind on the 4.7.0 release. This is a deadline we set for ourselves, so it only matters to ourselves. I was going to say I'd probably cut it today, but I think we should maybe fix this inode parsing bug, which someone added in. It looks like a pretty simple issue. They included code that looks fine, so we can just do that. A question I had maybe for the larger group was, I thought we had wrapped all the table generate calls with a try. Like I thought there was something in virtual tables, but I couldn't find it. All I could find was something that's wrapping all of the constraint matching.
Well, I think the generate function is in a try catch already, but yeah, might have to check why it is still crashing. For that specific case, though, the fix is more on the line of changing S to I to S to UL, because the inode it's a U int 32T, and S to I expects int 32T, int 32, and it throws an out of range exception if the number is above.
Makes sense.
So
Yeah, I guess there are two things. Like, that's a great simple fix. We should get that into 4.7.0, and then maybe a different one is like, is generate wrapped in try? That just seems weird because I thought it was, and it sounds like you thought it was. So it's a thing to look at. And then there's the Chrome extensions refactor, and I'm not sure where the state of that is. It would be nice to get that in. So we got those. You asked about the Big Sur naming bug. I propose we test this after we cut 4.7.0. I'm going to just remove this agenda item because we're not really talking about it. Users want ARM packages. Yes, they do. I spent a long time looking at the GS table this weekend, and it was atrocious, and I put up 3 PRs fixing 3 of the most egregious problems with it. 2 of them have merged. That's everything. Anyone have any questions before I delete these agenda items?
What are we going to do with the agenda items we haven't discussed?
I mean, I don't know.
Preserve
I'll
them
take
in
a
the
couple
channel?
of notes. I mean,
Maybe we do a little offline.
if anyone cares, they'll ask them somewhere else.
Yeah. Okay.
But I have 3 minutes. If anyone wish to ask about any of the things I just blew through.
I mean, for the Big Sur versioning issue, like, do we just need someone to test a potential fix, or what's the issue?
So the fix is already merged. I think I've put the steps in the issue about how to go about testing it. I've tested it on 3 different Intel machines running from Mojave to Catalina to Big Sur. And according to me, they behave as expected after the PR is merged. For some reason, Ceph couldn't reproduce it, and
Yeah, it showed
I
up as
haven't been
wrong
able
for
to.
me. Oh, I was going to say we should just retest with 4.7.0. Like, once we cut the release,
Yeah,
we test
sure,
it again.
That sounds fine, because it's been merged for like a month, so that should be okay.
Okay, just shoot me a DM if you need a test. I have a Big Sur machine.
Okay.
Intel.
Cool.
I have M1 and Intel ones on my desk, so I'm mostly just waiting to cut a real release, and then we can be sure we have the same binary and not be like pulling things out of the CI jobs.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Anyone have questions about ARM? I mean, other than just yes, people want it.
I really have to enroll into the AWS because we still have the old packages in there and people are yelling at me.
What do you
volunteer to help test the build steps that are already documented, right?
Alessandro, what do you need?
I have to follow the enrollment procedure to the AWS so I can upload the packages for ARM to the website.
Do you wanna do that with me later on today? Want to do that alone?
I can try alone, then but probably I will bother you if I fail.
Okay, it's easy. If it's easier, you find me online and we'll schedule a time, and I'll just make you credentials.
Okay, thank you.
I don't remember if you have simple access to the 1Password vaults yet, so like it's easy for me.
No, that MacBook I had is no longer exists, and that is where I had the 1Password access. So it's destroyed.
Yeah, just get me then. It's easy.
Okay.
And I mentioned that I looked at a GS and it was horribly broken.
Danahy, which is a former.
That's all.
Nice.
I PR'd a giant bunch of comments explaining effectively the impedance mismatch between a GS and Osquery and the existing shims that someone wrote to bridge the two. So it makes a little bit more sense this way.
Yeah, I read about it when you wrote the message, but yeah, I was puzzled. I never used it, honestly.
I started to. Okay. Anyone else? Stefano, thanks for looking at that. I will note that in the
Have
things.
other people seen development had a whole description of their different job titles? Have other people seen that?
Okay. Well, thank you all for your time and pretty nice enrollment discussion. I think we get to kill a flag soon, so that's always good.
It doesn't quite say that.
Great.
Right.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.